Please spare me. Thus the CEO's desperate plea and the single father who changed everything. The boardroom of Hartwell Industries was known for two things: the cold gleam of its glass walls and the colder gleam in the eyes of its most powerful occupant. Richard Hartwell, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of small moments to change lives, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness True Stories. Also, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? At 52, Richard had built an empire from nothing, crushing competitors, dismissing employees without blinking, and earning a reputation that made groan. Men trembled before they even entered his office. He was not a man who asked for anything. He was a man who demanded. So when those two words, "Please spare me," it had left his lips in a broken, desperate whisper, the entire room froze in collective disbelief. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody except one man, a quiet, unremarkable figure standing near the back of the room with grease still faintly visible on his hands from a morning of maintenance work. His name was Daniel Mercer, and he was nobody special, or so everyone thought. Daniel was 38 years old, a single father raising his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, on a salary that barely covered their small apartment rent and her school supplies. He worked as a maintenance technician at Hartwell Industries, a man who fixed broken pipes and flickering lights, and was largely invisible to people like Richard Hartwell. He had arrived at the boardroom that morning, only to repair a faulty ventilation panel near the ceiling, intending to finish quickly and disappear back into the building's quiet corridors. He had no reason to stay. He had every reason to go. But fate had other plans. The chaos began without warning. A fire had broken out in the electrical room 2 floors below, sending thick, acrid smoke snaking through the ventilation shafts. The very same shafts Daniel had been working on minutes earlier. The building's fire suppression system, outdated and partially defective, failed to trigger in time. When the smoke began pouring into the boardroom through the vents, panic erupted instantly. Executives in expensive suits scrambled for the door, shouting over each other, knocking over chairs, abandoning every pretense of professionalism. In the stampede, Richard Hartwell, the man who owned the building, the man whose name was on every door and every paycheck, stumbled and fell hard against the edge of the conference table. His head struck the corner with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor. Everyone around him kept running. Nobody stopped. Richard looked up through blurring vision and saw feet rushing past him, heard the thunderous chaos of people saving themselves, and in a voice stripped of all its usual authority and power, he whispered those 2 words that stunned even himself: "Please spare me." Daniel heard it. He was already moving toward the ventilation panel to shut the smoke flow. Manually, when he caught the sound, faint, broken, human, beneath all the noise, he turned. He saw Richard on the floor, blood trickling from a gash above his temple, the smoke thickening fast around him. Daniel did not stop to calculate the risk. He did not think about the fact that this man had never once acknowledged his existence in 3 years of working in this building. He did not think about the irony that Richard Hartwell, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was being saved by a man who struggled to pay his daughter's school fees. He simply acted. Daniel dropped to his knees beside Richard, pulled the man's arm across his shoulders, and hauled him upright with the kind of strength that only comes from years of physical labor and quiet endurance. Richard groaned. Daniel half carried, half dragged him toward room, moving low beneath the thickest layers of smoke, guiding them both by memory because his eyes were stinging and the visibility was nearly zero. Twice he nearly lost his footing. Once Richard's weight almost pulled them both down, but Daniel held on, tightened his grip, and kept moving. He had not come this far in life, raising Lily alone after her mother left, working double shifts, never missing a single school, play or parent-teacher meeting, to stop when things got hard. Getting out meant getting up, always, when they finally burst through the emergency exit door and collapsed onto the open stairwell landing. The fresh air hit them like cold water. Daniel sat gasping, his arms still around Richard's heaving shoulders. Security and emergency personnel came rushing up within moments. Paramedics arrived seconds later. As they placed an oxygen mask over Richard's face and began assessing his injury, the CEO turned his head and looked at Daniel, really looked at him. Perhaps for the first time. His eyes were wet, and not just from the smoke. He opened his mouth to say something. Daniel shook his head gently. "Don't," Daniel said quietly. "Just breathe." Richard Hartwell, a man who had given speeches to thousands of shareholders and negotiated deals worth billions of dollars, simply nodded and did exactly that. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the company, through the industry, and eventually far beyond it. Richard recovered fully. At a company-wide gathering held to mark the reopening of the renovated building, now fitted with a completely upgraded fire safety system, Richard Hartwell stood at the podium and spoke not about profits or projections, but about a man in ordinary work clothes who had made a split-second choice that most people in that room had failed to make. He announced that Daniel Mercer would be offered a full scholarship for his daughter, Lily, through the Hartwell Foundation, a newly created employee welfare fund in Daniel's honor, and a permanent senior facilities role, with a salary that would finally allow a good man to breathe a little easier. Daniel sat in the front row with Lily on his lap, her small head resting against his chest, completely unaware of how extraordinary her father truly was. She just knew he always showed up. She just knew he never let go. And in that simple, quiet truth lives something far more powerful than any boardroom deal or corporate empire. It lived the kind of courage that does not announce itself, does not wait for applause, and does not calculate the cost before choosing to care. Daniel Mercer had walked into that building that morning as a maintenance technician. He walked out of it as a reminder to everyone who witnessed what happened that the most important thing a person can ever repair is not a broken pipe or a faulty wire, or it is the moment when someone needs you and you choose, without hesitation, to be there. If this story moved your heart and reminded you that true kindness lives in ordinary people doing extraordinary things, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Kindness True Stories, where every story is a reminder that goodness is always worth celebrating.